Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning, pull back your curtains, and instead of seeing your familiar neighborhood, you're greeted by a world encased in ice. Not just your driveway or the local pond, but everything. The oceans, frozen solid from surface to seafloor. The continents, buried under miles of glacial ice so thick that mountains disappear beneath white, crystalline expanses that stretch to every horizon. The equator, once a belt of tropical warmth, now indistinguishable from the poles under a blanket of ice that reflects sunlight back into space like a cosmic mirror. This isn't science fiction. This isn't the plot of the next disaster movie. This actually happened to our planet not once but multiple times, and the terrifying part, it could happen again. Welcome to the world of Snowball Earth, where our entire planet transformed into a frozen marble spinning through space. And today we're going to explore what would happen if Earth experienced this catastrophic freeze for a second time in human history. But here's the thing that'll keep you watching until the very end. The last time this happened, it nearly wiped out all life on Earth. And if it happened today, with our current civilization, the consequences would be beyond anything you've ever imagined. I'm going to take you on a journey through the most extreme climate scenario our planet has ever faced. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why scientists lose sleep thinking about this possibility. We'll explore the terrifying chain of events that could trigger a second Snowball Earth. Witness how our modern world would crumble in ways that make every disaster movie look like a children's bedtime story, and discover the shocking truth about whether humanity could even survive such an event. But before we dive into the nightmare scenario of what a modern Snowball Earth would look like, you need to understand something crucial. This isn't just theoretical doomsday speculation. The conditions that created the original Snowball Earth events are still present in our climate system today, lurking like a sleeping giant that could awaken under the right circumstances. And those circumstances? They're more fragile than you think. The original Snowball Earth events happened between 750 and 580 million years ago, during what scientists call the Cryogenian period. But here's what makes this absolutely chilling. The Earth didn't gradually freeze over the course of millions of years. Once the process began, our planet plunged into a complete freeze in what geologists consider to be a geological instant, possibly within just a few thousand years. Imagine that! A thriving blue-green world transformed into a white, lifeless ice ball faster than human civilization has existed. Now I know what you're thinking. That was hundreds of millions of years ago. The Earth is different now. We have technology. We understand climate. And you're right, the Earth is different. But that difference might actually make a second Snowball Earth event more devastating, not less. Here's why. The original Snowball Earth occurred when life was simple, mostly single-celled organisms floating in ancient oceans. There were no complex ecosystems, no food chains, no forests, and certainly no cities, power grids, or 7 billion people depending on a stable climate for their survival. When the freeze happened, life found a way to endure in small pockets of liquid water around volcanic vents and hot springs. But today we've built a civilization that assumes the climate will remain within certain predictable parameters. Our entire way of life, from the food we eat to the energy we consume, from the cities we've built to the technology we depend on, is calibrated to work within a narrow band of environmental conditions. A second Snowball Earth wouldn't just be a climate disaster, it would be the complete collapse of everything we call civilization. So how could this actually happen? What could trigger such a catastrophic freeze in our modern world? The answer lies in understanding something called the ice-albedo feedback loop, and it's both elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. Here's how it works. When ice forms on Earth's surface, it reflects sunlight back into space, instead of absorbing it as heat. This is called albedo. The more ice that forms, the more sunlight gets reflected, which means less heat is absorbed by the planet, which causes more ice to form, which reflects even more sunlight, which creates even more ice. It's a runaway process that, once it reaches a critical tipping point, becomes unstoppable. During the original Snowball Earth events, this feedback loop was triggered by a combination of factors. Massive volcanic eruptions that blocked sunlight with ash and debris, the positioning of continents near the poles which allowed ice sheets to grow, and changes in ocean circulation that disrupted the planet's heat distribution system. But in our modern world, we've actually created new ways this process could be triggered, and some of them are already in motion. Climate change, ironically, could be the very thing that pushes us toward a Snowball Earth scenario. I know that sounds backwards, since we're currently experiencing global warming, but here's the terrifying connection. As global temperatures rise, they're disrupting ocean currents that have been stable for thousands of years. The Gulf Stream, which carries warm water from the equator to northern Europe, is already showing signs of weakening due to melting Arctic ice, changing ocean salinity. If major ocean currents like this were to shut down completely, it would redistribute heat around the planet in unpredictable ways. Regions that are currently temperate could suddenly become frigid, allowing ice sheets to form in places where they've never existed in human history. But there's another trigger that's even more immediate and frightening: volcanic winter. A single massive volcanic eruption, or a series of smaller ones, could inject enough ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to block a significant percentage of sunlight from reaching Earth's surface. This has happened before in recorded history on a smaller scale. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora caused global temperatures to drop so severely that 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Crops failed worldwide, causing famine and social upheaval. Now imagine that, but 10 times worse and lasting not for 1 year, but for decades or centuries. The Yellowstone supervolcano, which sits beneath one of America's most famous national parks, is overdue for an eruption. When it goes off, and geological evidence suggests it's not a matter of if but when, it will inject more ash and gas into the atmosphere than any event in recorded human history. The initial eruption would be devastating enough, but the climate effects could trigger the ice-albedo feedback loop that sends our planet into a complete freeze. And here's the part that should absolutely terrify you. Once a Snowball Earth event begins, there's no stopping it with current technology. Think about our most powerful interventions in climate and weather. We can seed clouds to encourage rain. We can build seawalls to hold back rising oceans. We can even discuss theoretical geoengineering projects to manage global warming. But stopping a planetary freeze that's driven by fundamental physics, that's beyond anything we're capable of. The ice would advance relentlessly from the poles toward the equator, growing thicker and more reflective with each passing year. As it advanced, it would crush everything in its path. Cities would be ground to rubble under glaciers miles thick. Forests would be scraped from the landscape. Rivers and lakes would freeze solid, their ice layers growing deeper year after year until they resembled solid rock more than frozen water. But the crushing ice would only be the beginning of humanity's problems. As the planet's surface froze, the hydrological cycle that we depend on for fresh water would shut down almost completely. No evaporation means no clouds, which means no precipitation. The water locked up in ice would stay locked up, creating a global drought unlike anything in Earth's history. Agriculture would become impossible across most of the planet. The growing seasons we've planned our entire food system around would disappear, as temperatures plummeted far below anything crops could survive. Even greenhouse agriculture would become nearly impossible, as the energy required to heat growing spaces would exceed any practical capacity to generate power. Speaking of power generation, our electrical grids would face challenges that make current winter storms look trivial. Solar panels would be useless under thick cloud cover and reduced sunlight. Wind turbines would freeze solid or be destroyed by the extreme weather conditions. Hydroelectric dams would freeze, stopping the flow of water that generates electricity. Even nuclear power plants would struggle, as their cooling systems would freeze, and their fuel supply chains would be disrupted by the global transportation collapse. And transportation would indeed collapse completely. Airports would be buried under ice and snow, making air travel impossible. Ships would be trapped in frozen harbours, their hulls crushed by expanding ice. Roads would become impassable, first from snow and ice, then buried entirely under advancing glaciers. Rail systems would buckle and break under the extreme temperature changes and the weight of accumulating ice. The global supply chains that keep our modern world functioning would snap like overstretched rubber bands. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of a modern Snowball Earth scenario is how it would affect the 7 billion people who currently call this planet home. The population centres where most humans live, the coastal cities and temperate regions that support the highest densities of people, would be among the first areas to become uninhabitable. As ice advanced and temperatures dropped, massive human migrations would begin. Entire populations would be forced to flee toward the equator, seeking any pocket of habitable land that remained unfrozen. But here's the terrifying reality. Even the equator wouldn't stay warm enough to support human civilization for long. During the original Snowball Earth events, geological evidence suggests that even tropical regions were frozen, with ice extending all the way to the equator. If this happened again, there would literally be nowhere on Earth's surface for large human populations to survive long term. The social and political consequences would be catastrophic beyond imagination. As resources became scarce and habitable land disappeared, conflicts over the remaining unfrozen areas would be inevitable. Governments would collapse as they became unable to provide basic services to their populations. International cooperation would break down as every nation focused solely on the survival of its own people. And all of this would be happening while the planet continued to freeze, month after month, year after year, with no end in sight. The psychological impact alone would shatter human society in ways we're completely unprepared for. Imagine watching your world literally disappear under ice, knowing that every day brings you closer to an uninhabitable wasteland. The constant stress of survival, the breakdown of all familiar systems, the loss of hope for a normal future, would create a level of collective trauma that has never existed in human history. Mental health systems, already strained in our current world, would collapse entirely. Depression, anxiety, and panic would become epidemic as people watched their communities buried under advancing ice sheets. Suicide rates would skyrocket as the reality of the situation became undeniable. The very concept of planning for the future would become meaningless when the future holds nothing but an ever-deepening freeze. Children born during a Snowball Earth event would grow up in a world where warmth, green spaces, and abundant food were just stories told by older generations. They would know only cold, scarcity, and struggle. The psychological development of entire generations would be fundamentally altered by living in permanent survival mode. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. The technology we're so proud of, the digital infrastructure that connects our world, would become completely useless. Server farms require massive amounts of electricity and sophisticated cooling systems to operate. During a global freeze, maintaining these systems would become impossible. The internet, which we've come to think of as permanent and indestructible, would simply vanish. Satellites would lose contact with ground stations, cell towers would be destroyed by ice storms or simply abandoned when there's no power to run them. All of our accumulated digital knowledge, the vast libraries of information stored in cloud servers and databases, would disappear. Centuries of human learning, art, culture, and scientific advancement would be lost not because the information was destroyed, but because we could no longer access the systems that stored it. The irony is devastating. At the moment when humanity would need all of its accumulated knowledge to survive the greatest challenge in our species' history, that knowledge would become completely inaccessible. Medical care would regress to medieval levels almost immediately. Hospitals require enormous amounts of energy to operate, from heating and lighting to running life support equipment and diagnostic machines. Pharmaceutical manufacturing depends on complex global supply chains that would be severed within months of a Snowball Earth event beginning. People with diabetes would lose access to insulin, heart patients would run out of medication. Simple infections that are easily treatable today would become death sentences. Surgical procedures would become impossible without proper sterilization equipment and anesthetics. Even basic first aid supplies would become precious commodities as manufacturing stopped and existing stockpiles were depleted. The birth rate would plummet as pregnancy and childbirth became exponentially more dangerous without modern medical care. Child mortality would soar to levels not seen since the Dark Ages. The human population would begin shrinking rapidly, not just from the immediate effects of cold and starvation, but from the complete breakdown of the medical systems that keep us alive. And the animals that share our planet would fare no better. Domestic animals, bred over thousands of years to depend on human care, would die in massive numbers. Livestock couldn't survive in the extreme cold without heated shelters and stored feed, both of which would become impossible to maintain. Pets abandoned by owners who could no longer care for them would freeze or starve. The centuries-old partnership between humans and domesticated animals would end in a matter of seasons. Wild animals would face their own catastrophe. Migration routes that species have used for millions of years would be blocked by ice. Food sources would disappear under snow and ice. Predator-prey relationships would collapse as ecosystems froze solid from the ground up. Marine life would face perhaps the worst fate of all. As oceans began to freeze, not just at the surface but throughout their entire depth, fish populations would be trapped in shrinking pockets of liquid water. The vast underwater ecosystems that have flourished for hundreds of millions of years would be snuffed out like candles in the wind. Even the microorganisms that form the foundation of all life on Earth would struggle to survive. The bacteria and plankton that produce much of our planet's oxygen would die off as the oceans froze. The very air we breathe would gradually become less suitable for supporting complex life. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of a modern Snowball Earth scenario is how helpless our vaunted technology would make us feel. We've become so dependent on complex systems that most people have lost the basic survival skills that kept our ancestors alive through difficult times. How many people today know how to preserve food without refrigeration? How to build a fire without matches or lighters? How to find or purify water without modern filtration systems? How to make clothing warm enough for extreme cold? Our cities, marvels of engineering and organization, would become death traps. The high-rise buildings that house millions of people require constant energy inputs to remain habitable. Elevators would stop working, leaving residents stranded on upper floors. Water pressure would fail, making plumbing useless. Heating systems would shut down, turning apartments into freezers. The urban environment that has allowed human civilization to reach unprecedented heights would become utterly hostile to human survival. Cities designed for efficiency and convenience would offer no resources for people trying to live through a planetary freeze. There would be no farmland to grow food, no forest to provide firewood, no streams or wells for water. Rural areas would offer slightly better chances for survival, but only slightly. Farmland would be frozen solid, making agriculture impossible. Wells would freeze. Livestock would die. Even people with survival skills and rural properties would face the reality that no amount of preparation could sustain them through decades or centuries of planetary winter. The few groups that might have a chance of long-term survival would be those near geothermal features, places where the Earth's internal heat creates pockets of warmth even during a global freeze. But these locations are rare and scattered, capable of supporting only tiny populations. Iceland, with its abundant geothermal energy, might become one of the last refuges for human civilization. The hot springs and geysers that make the island famous could provide heat and liquid water, even as the rest of the world froze solid. But Iceland's current population is only around 370,000 people, and its food production capacity is limited. It couldn't possibly support the millions of climate refugees who would try to reach it. Similar geothermal refuges exist in places like Yellowstone, the Kamchatka Peninsula, and parts of New Zealand. But these scattered oases of warmth would be like tiny lifeboats in an ocean of ice, capable of preserving only small remnants of human civilization. The scientific community that studies climate has run models of what a modern Snowball Earth event might look like, and the results are uniformly terrifying. Unlike the gradual warming or cooling that characterizes normal climate change, a Snowball Earth transition would be characterized by accelerating feedback loops that make the situation worse with each passing month. As ice coverage increased, more sunlight would be reflected back into space, causing temperatures to drop faster. As temperatures dropped, more water vapor would condense out of the atmosphere, reducing the greenhouse effect and causing even more cooling. As plant life died off from cold and lack of sunlight, less carbon dioxide would be absorbed from the atmosphere. But this wouldn't help because the ice albedo effect would be so much stronger than any greenhouse warming. The mathematical model suggests that once the ice albedo feedback loop reached a critical threshold, probably somewhere around 30% ice coverage of the planet's surface, the transition to full Snowball Earth conditions would be unstoppable with any technology we currently possess or could realistically develop in the time frame we'd have available. This is the stuff of nightmares for climate scientists. A climate system that could flip into a completely different state faster than human civilization could adapt, creating conditions that would persist for thousands or even millions of years. And the most chilling part? Some researchers believe we might already be closer to that tipping point than we realize. The warning signs are already appearing and they're hiding in plain sight. Scientists studying ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica have discovered something that keeps them awake at night. The patterns we're seeing today in global ice loss and ocean current disruption are eerily similar to the preliminary indicators that preceded the original Snowball Earth events. But here's what makes this absolutely terrifying. We're not just passive observers of these changes. Human activity has accelerated natural climate processes to a degree that's unprecedented in Earth's history. We've pumped so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we've fundamentally altered the chemistry of our oceans. We've melted so much polar ice that we've changed the salinity levels that drive major ocean currents. We've deforested so much land that we've disrupted regional weather patterns across entire continents. In other words, we've created the perfect storm of conditions that could trigger a second Snowball Earth, and we're doing it faster than nature ever could on its own. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the massive current system that includes the Gulf Stream, is already showing signs of instability. This system carries warm water northward and cold water southward, distributing heat around the planet in a pattern that has remained stable for the entire history of human civilization. But satellite data and deep ocean measurements show this circulation is weakening at an alarming rate. If it collapses completely, Europe would plunge into a deep freeze almost overnight. Temperatures in London could drop to levels similar to northern Canada within a single decade. The knock-on effects would ripple around the globe, disrupting weather patterns everywhere and potentially triggering the formation of new ice sheets in regions that haven't been glaciated in millions of years. But ocean currents are just one piece of the puzzle. The real tipping point could come from something far more sudden and dramatic. Imagine waking up tomorrow to news reports that a massive volcanic eruption has occurred somewhere in the world. Not just any eruption, but a supervolcanic event that injects billions of tons of ash and sulfur compounds into the upper atmosphere. The initial destruction would be devastating, but that would be nothing compared to what happens next. Within weeks, the ash cloud would spread around the entire planet, blocking sunlight and causing global temperatures to plummet. Crops would fail worldwide as growing seasons disappeared. But here's the crucial part. As temperatures dropped and ice began forming in regions where it hasn't existed in human memory, the ice albedo feedback loop would kick in. Each new patch of ice would reflect more sunlight back into space, causing further cooling, which would create more ice, which would reflect even more sunlight. Within a few years, what started as a volcanic winter would transform into the beginning of a new Snowball Earth event. The most frightening aspect of this scenario is how quickly it could unfold. Unlike the gradual climate changes we're used to thinking about, a volcanic trigger for Snowball Earth would compress the timeline from decades to years, or even months. Agricultural systems that feed billions of people would collapse before governments could implement any meaningful response. Supply chains that deliver food, medicine, and fuel to cities would break down before emergency stockpiles could be established. Power grids would fail before alternative energy sources could be deployed at scale. Humanity would be racing against time to adapt to conditions that are changing faster than our social, economic, and technological systems can respond. And the cruelest irony? The very technologies we've developed to fight climate change could become completely useless in a Snowball Earth scenario. Solar panels, which we've invested trillions of dollars in as a clean energy solution, would generate almost no power under the perpetually cloudy skies and reduce sunlight of a volcanic winter. Wind turbines would be destroyed by the extreme weather conditions that would precede the freeze. Even our most advanced climate modeling systems would be overwhelmed by the speed and magnitude of the changes occurring. The electric vehicles we've promoted as the future of transportation would become useless as power grids failed and charging infrastructure was destroyed. The smart cities we've built with their interconnected systems and digital infrastructure would become technological graveyards when the networks that connect them went dark. But perhaps most devastating of all would be the psychological impact of realizing that all of our preparation for climate change has been focused on warming, not cooling. Every climate adaptation strategy, every piece of infrastructure we've built to handle rising temperatures and sea levels, every policy we've implemented to reduce carbon emissions would be not just useless, but actually counterproductive in a Snowball Earth scenario. The insulation systems designed to keep buildings cool would trap deadly cold inside. The drought-resistant crops we've developed would be completely vulnerable to extreme cold and reduced sunlight. The seawalls built to hold back rising oceans would be pointless when those same oceans freeze solid. Humanity would face the ultimate cruel twist. After spending decades preparing for a warming planet, we could find ourselves dying on a freezing one. The economic collapse would be swift and total. Financial markets, which panic over minor disruptions in supply chains or temporary political instability, would simply cease to function when faced with the complete breakdown of global civilization. Money itself would become meaningless when there's nothing left to buy and no system left to process transactions. The concept of debt would disappear overnight, not because it was forgiven, but because the institutions that created and managed it would no longer exist. Retirement savings, college funds, investment portfolios, all of the financial planning that people spend their entire lives building would evaporate as the systems that supported them shut down permanently. Insurance companies, which we rely on to protect us from catastrophic losses, would go bankrupt immediately. No insurance policy covers the complete freezing of the planet. The risk models that determine premiums and coverage are based on historical data that assumes certain environmental constants. A Snowball Earth event would render all of that data completely meaningless. Real estate, humanity's most valuable asset class, would become literally worthless as properties were buried under advancing ice sheets. The mortgages that millions of people are still paying would become surreal reminders of a world that no longer exists, legal obligations to pay for houses that are now crushed under miles of glacial ice. But the economic collapse would be just the beginning of the social upheaval that would tear human civilization apart. Legal systems depend on stable institutions and the ability to enforce laws. When governments collapse and law enforcement agencies can no longer operate, the social contracts that hold societies together would dissolve. Not because people choose to abandon them, but because the systems that support them would simply stop functioning. Courts couldn't operate without heated buildings and reliable electricity. Prisons couldn't function without food supplies and guard rotations. Police forces couldn't patrol when vehicles won't start and communication systems are down. In the absence of functioning legal systems, communities would revert to more primitive forms of organization based on kinship, tribal loyalty, or simple survival alliances. The rule of law that has taken centuries to establish would disappear in a matter of seasons. Educational systems, which we consider fundamental to human progress, would shut down completely. Schools require heated buildings, transportation for students, and supply chains for materials. Universities depend on complex support systems and the ability to attract students and faculty from around the world. The accumulated knowledge of human civilization isn't just stored in books and computers, it's embedded in the minds of specialists and experts who dedicate their lives to understanding complex subjects. When these people are forced to focus entirely on immediate survival, their expertise becomes inaccessible to society even if they themselves survive. Imagine a world where brain surgeons are chopping firewood to stay warm, where nuclear physicists are hunting for food, where the world's leading climate scientists are huddled around fires trying to keep from freezing to death. All of that specialized knowledge would effectively disappear from human civilization, even though the people who possess it might still be alive. The loss of institutional memory would be catastrophic. The procedures for maintaining nuclear power plants, the protocols for managing water treatment facilities, the techniques for manufacturing medicine, all of this knowledge is stored not just in manuals and databases, but in the trained minds of professionals who know how to apply it. When these systems shut down and these professionals are scattered or dead, restarting civilization would mean not just rebuilding physical infrastructure, but recreating all of the human knowledge and expertise required to operate it. Languages would begin to disappear at an unprecedented rate. Small communities struggling to survive would have no resources to maintain linguistic diversity. Children would grow up speaking only the languages necessary for immediate survival in their local groups. The rich tapestry of human languages, each carrying unique ways of understanding and describing the world, would shrink to a handful of survival dialects. Cultural traditions that have been passed down for thousands of years would be abandoned as communities focused entirely on staying alive. Music, art, literature, philosophy, all of the things that make human life rich and meaningful beyond mere survival would be forgotten as luxuries that no one could afford to maintain. Religious and spiritual practices would either disappear entirely or evolve into desperate attempts to explain and cope with the catastrophe. The sophisticated theological and philosophical traditions that have developed over millennia would be replaced by primitive survival-focused beliefs. The very concept of human progress would be called into question. Generations that grew up during a Snowball Earth event would have no experience of technological advancement, social progress, or expanding knowledge. The idea that things could get better over time, which has driven human civilization for centuries, would seem like a fantasy from a lost golden age. But here's the most haunting thought of all. If humanity somehow managed to survive a second Snowball Earth event, the species that emerge from it would be fundamentally different from what we are today. Not just culturally or technologically different, but potentially biologically different. The extreme selection pressures of surviving in a frozen world would favour certain genetic traits over others. People with better cold tolerance, more efficient metabolism, stronger immune systems adapted to harsh conditions would be more likely to survive and reproduce. Over the centuries or millennia that a Snowball Earth event might last, human evolution could accelerate in response to the radically changed environment. The humans who eventually inherited a thawed planet might be as different from us as we are from our ancient ancestors, and they might look back on our current civilization the way we look back on the lost civilizations of the past, as a mysterious golden age that achieved wonders we can barely understand before disappearing into the ice and darkness of a frozen world. The question that haunts researchers who study these scenarios isn't just whether humanity could survive a second Snowball Earth event, it's whether anything recognizable as human civilization could survive it. Because even if some people made it through, the world they would inherit might be so different, and they themselves might be so changed, that calling them human in any sense we would recognize might no longer be accurate. This isn't just about climate change anymore. This is about the fundamental fragility of everything we call civilization, everything we think of as permanent, everything we assume will still be here tomorrow. And the most terrifying part? The process might already be beginning. Recent satellite data from NASA and the European Space Agency has revealed something that's making climate scientists around the world extremely nervous. The massive ice sheets of West Antarctica aren't just melting, they're destabilizing in ways that could trigger cascading effects across the entire global climate system. But here's what's truly alarming. The rate of change is accelerating exponentially. What climate models predicted would take decades is happening in years. What they thought would take years is happening in months. And some changes that weren't supposed to occur until the next century are already visible in real-time satellite imagery. The Thwaites Glacier, often called the Doomsday Glacier by researchers, is collapsing faster than any worst-case scenario previously modelled. This single glacier holds back enough ice to raise global sea levels by over 2 feet. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is that Thwaites acts like a cork in a bottle, holding back the entire West Antarctic ice sheet. When it goes, and current data suggests this could happen within the next decade, it won't just release its own ice. It will trigger the collapse of glacial systems across an area the size of Mexico, releasing enough fresh water to fundamentally alter ocean chemistry and circulation patterns around the globe. And here's where it gets absolutely terrifying. This massive influx of cold fresh water could be the exact trigger needed to shut down the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation completely. Think about what happens when you pour fresh water into salt water. The fresh water, being less dense, sits on top and creates a barrier that prevents the normal mixing that drives ocean currents. Now imagine this happening on a scale so massive that it disrupts current systems that have been stable for over 10,000 years. The Gulf Stream, which carries 30 times more water than all the world's rivers combined, could simply stop flowing within a matter of years. When that happens, the climate effects would be immediate and catastrophic. Northern Europe would experience temperature drops of 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit in a single decade. London's climate would become similar to northern Alaska. Scandinavia would become uninhabitable. The growing seasons that currently feed hundreds of millions of people would disappear entirely. But the effects wouldn't stop there. The disruption of Atlantic circulation would alter weather patterns across the entire northern hemisphere. The jet stream, already becoming increasingly unstable due to Arctic warming, would become completely chaotic, bringing Arctic air masses far south into regions that have never experienced such extreme cold. Imagine Chicago experiencing temperatures normally seen in northern Canada, but for months at a time instead of just during brief cold snaps. Picture crops failing across the American Midwest as growing seasons become too short and too cold to support agriculture. Visualize energy grids that were never designed for such extreme conditions failing as demand for heating skyrockets beyond their capacity to supply power. The social and economic disruption would create a feedback loop that makes the climate crisis worse. As northern regions become uninhabitable, massive human migrations would begin. Millions of climate refugees from Europe and northern North America would flee toward warmer regions, creating political instability and resource conflicts that would prevent coordinated responses to the climate emergency. Agricultural systems would collapse not just from cold, but from the chaos created by displaced populations competing for remaining arable land. Supply chains would break down as transportation infrastructure in cold regions became impassable. The global economy would enter a death spiral as entire continents became economically unproductive. And here's the most chilling part. All of this disruption would accelerate the formation of ice sheets in regions where they haven't existed in millions of years. The Canadian Shield, a massive geological formation that covers most of northern Canada, has the perfect topography for supporting continental ice sheets. During previous ice ages, this region was buried under ice miles thick. As temperatures dropped due to the collapse of ocean circulation, new glaciers would begin forming on the shield's elevated plateaus. These glaciers would grow rapidly, fed by the extreme precipitation that occurs when warm, moist air masses collide with the Arctic conditions spreading south from the disrupted polar regions. Within decades, ice sheets could cover areas the size of entire countries, reflecting sunlight back into space and accelerating the cooling process. The Great Lakes region, with its abundant fresh water and relatively flat terrain, would become a perfect environment for ice sheet formation. Imagine glaciers growing outward from the lakes themselves, fed by the massive amounts of water available and the increasingly cold conditions. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Toronto would be in the direct path of these advancing ice sheets, but the process wouldn't stop at continental ice formation. The real nightmare scenario begins when ocean temperatures drop enough for sea ice to form in regions where it has never existed in human history. The North Atlantic, currently kept ice-free by the warm waters of the Gulf Stream, would begin freezing as that current system collapsed. Sea ice would form first around the coasts of Greenland and northern Canada, then spread southward as ocean temperatures continued to drop. Unlike the seasonal sea ice that forms and melts each year in the Arctic, this new ice would be permanent, growing thicker each winter and never fully melting during increasingly brief and cold summers. The albedo effect of this expanding ice coverage would accelerate the cooling process dramatically. As more ocean surface became covered with reflective ice, less solar energy would be absorbed by the dark ocean waters. This would cause further cooling, which would allow ice to form even further south, creating a runaway feedback loop that becomes impossible to stop once it reaches a critical threshold. Computer models suggest that once sea ice coverage in the North Atlantic reaches approximately 40% of the ocean surface, the feedback effects become so strong that ice formation would continue even if greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere doubled overnight. In other words, there would be a point of no return where even our most extreme efforts to warm the planet through industrial emissions couldn't prevent the continued expansion of ice coverage. The psychological impact on humanity would be unlike anything our species has ever experienced. Previous disasters, even global ones like pandemics or world wars, have been temporary. People could endure them because they believed conditions would eventually improve. But a Snowball Earth event would be different because it would be permanent on any timescale meaningful to human life. Imagine trying to maintain hope and social cohesion when everyone understands that conditions will only get worse, year after year, possibly for thousands of years. The mental health crisis would be unprecedented in scope and intensity. Children born as the ice began advancing would grow up in a world where warmth, green spaces, and abundant food were just stories told by older generations. Their entire psychological development would occur in an environment of scarcity, cold, and constant threat. The trauma would be so pervasive that it would literally reshape human consciousness. But perhaps even more disturbing would be the realization that our technological civilization, which we've come to view as humanity's greatest achievement, would become our greatest liability during a Snowball Earth event. The complexity that makes our modern world so capable and efficient also makes it incredibly fragile. Our electrical grids depend on precise balancing of supply and demand across vast networks. Our transportation systems require exact coordination of schedules and routes. Our communication networks need constant maintenance and power to function. All of these systems would begin failing simultaneously as extreme weather overwhelmed their design parameters. And unlike simpler technologies that can be repaired with basic tools and local materials, modern infrastructure requires specialized parts, trained technicians, and industrial supply chains to maintain. When those supply chains break down, repair becomes impossible. When the trained technicians are struggling to survive, maintenance stops. When the power grid fails, everything connected to it becomes useless. Our cities, which house more than half of humanity, would become uninhabitable death traps. The high-rise buildings that efficiently house millions of people become deadly when elevators stop working and heating systems fail. The dense urban infrastructure that allows for efficient resource distribution becomes a nightmare when those resources stop flowing. Urban populations would face an impossible choice: stay in cities that are becoming uninhabitable, or flee to rural areas that lack the infrastructure to support them. Either choice would likely be fatal for the majority of people. The few humans who might survive would be those who already possessed pre-industrial survival skills and lived in areas with access to geothermal heat sources. But even these survivors would face challenges that go far beyond anything humans have ever endured. The complete breakdown of medical care would mean that injuries or illnesses that are easily treatable today would become death sentences. The loss of agricultural systems would force survivors to depend on hunting and gathering, in an environment where most plant and animal life has died from cold. Even the air itself would become hostile. As plant life died off, oxygen production would slow while carbon dioxide continued to be released from decomposing organic matter and ongoing geological processes. The atmospheric composition that humans evolved to breathe could change enough to make survival even more difficult, and the darkness would be perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of all. The volcanic ash or reduced sunlight that triggered the ice albedo feedback loop would create a world of perpetual twilight. Survivors would live in a dim, grey world where the sun, when visible at all, would be just a pale disk in a cloudy sky. The absence of normal day-night cycles would disrupt human circadian rhythms, leading to depression, insomnia, and cognitive impairment that would make survival even more challenging. The loss of seasonal variation would eliminate the natural cycles that have structured human life for millennia. But here's what makes this scenario even more terrifying. Unlike previous mass extinction events that were caused by external factors like asteroid impacts or supervolcanic eruptions, a modern Snowball Earth event could be triggered by our own actions. The greenhouse gases we've pumped into the atmosphere have already begun disrupting the ocean currents that regulate global climate. The ice we've melted has already changed ocean salinity levels. The forests we've cleared have already altered regional precipitation patterns. We've created a climate system that's increasingly unstable and prone to sudden, catastrophic shifts. And because these changes are happening faster than ever before in Earth's history, there's no time for gradual adaptation. Natural climate changes typically occur over thousands or millions of years, giving life time to evolve and adapt to new conditions. But human-induced climate change is happening in decades, and a triggered Snowball Earth event could occur in years. Evolution can't keep up with that rate of change. Ecosystems can't adapt that quickly, and human civilization, for all its technological sophistication, has never been tested against changes of such speed and magnitude. The most haunting aspect of this entire scenario is that it might already be too late to prevent it. The changes we've set in motion may have already passed the point where human intervention could alter the outcome. Ocean current systems take decades to respond to changes in temperature and salinity. Ice sheet dynamics operate on timescales of years to decades. Atmospheric chemistry changes can persist for centuries. Even if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, the climate system would continue changing based on what we've already done, and the feedback loops that could trigger a Snowball Earth event are already beginning to accelerate. Arctic sea ice is disappearing faster than ever recorded. Greenland's ice sheet is losing mass at an exponential rate. Antarctic glaciers are collapsing ahead of schedule. Each of these changes makes the others more likely and more severe. Each feedback loop that activates makes the overall system more unstable and more prone to sudden, irreversible shifts. The window for preventing a catastrophic climate transition may have already closed while we were still debating whether climate change was real, still arguing about the costs of reducing emissions, still assuming that gradual change meant we had time to adapt gradually. But perhaps the most chilling realization is that a Snowball Earth event wouldn't just be the end of our current civilization. It would be the end of the possibility for any technological civilization to develop on Earth for millions of years. The fossil fuels that powered our industrial revolution took hundreds of millions of years to form. We've burned through most of the easily accessible deposits in just a few centuries. If human civilization collapsed completely, any future intelligent species that evolved on Earth would find a planet largely stripped of the energy resources that made our technological development possible. The metals we've mined and concentrated in cities and industrial sites would be buried under miles of ice and then scattered by glacial action when the ice eventually melted. The knowledge we've accumulated would be lost completely. The infrastructure we've built would be ground to dust. A post-Snowball Earth planet might be capable of supporting simple life forms, but it might never again be capable of supporting a technological civilization advanced enough to understand what happened or to prevent it from happening again. And so we face a terrifying possibility that we are living through not just the potential end of human civilization, but the permanent end of the possibility for intelligence to flourish on this planet. The ice is already beginning to shift in ways that haven't been seen for hundreds of millions of years. The currents that regulate our climate are already showing signs of the instability that preceded previous Snowball Earth events. The feedback loops that could trap our planet in a permanent freeze are already beginning to activate. The question is no longer whether a second Snowball Earth could happen. The question is whether it's already beginning, and whether we have any time left to prepare for a world that could become completely frozen within our lifetimes. The signs are already there, hidden in the data streams flowing from research stations scattered across our planet's most remote regions. Temperature sensors buried deep in the Greenland ice sheet are recording changes that shouldn't be happening for another century. Ocean buoys floating in the North Atlantic are detecting salinity levels that match computer models of circulation collapse. Satellite images show ice patterns forming in configurations that scientists have only seen in theoretical projections of climate system failure. But here's what's keeping climatologists awake at night. These aren't isolated anomalies that might correct themselves over time. They're synchronized changes happening simultaneously across multiple Earth systems, like the first dominoes falling in a chain reaction that spans the entire planet. The permafrost monitoring stations scattered across Siberia and northern Canada are recording something unprecedented. The permanently frozen ground that has remained stable for tens of thousands of years is thawing at depths never before measured. But that's not the terrifying part. The terrifying part is what's being released as it thaws. Trapped within this ancient frozen soil are massive quantities of methane and carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases that have been locked away since the last ice age. As the permafrost melts, these gases are being released into the atmosphere at rates that dwarf human industrial emissions. Under normal circumstances, this would accelerate global warming. But in the unstable climate system we've created, this massive release of greenhouse gases could paradoxically trigger the exact opposite effect. Here's the nightmare scenario that climate scientists call the runaway paradox. As permafrost melting releases more greenhouse gases, it initially causes more warming. But this additional warming accelerates the melting of polar ice sheets, which dumps massive amounts of cold fresh water into the oceans. This fresh water disrupts the ocean currents that distribute heat around the planet, causing regional cooling that allows more ice to form. The ice formation triggers the albedo feedback effect, reflecting more sunlight and causing further cooling, which allows even more ice to form. Meanwhile, the permafrost continues melting and releasing greenhouse gases, but the cooling effect of the expanding ice coverage becomes so strong that it overwhelms the warming effect of the additional gases in the atmosphere. The result is a climate system that's simultaneously experiencing runaway greenhouse warming and runaway ice formation. The greenhouse gases keep the upper atmosphere warm, while the surface becomes increasingly cold and ice-covered. It's like living inside a planetary freezer that's powered by its own heat source, a system that becomes more efficient at cooling the surface the more energy it receives. Mathematical models of this scenario suggest it could unfold with shocking speed. Once the process begins, the transition from our current climate to full Snowball Earth conditions could occur within a single human generation. Children born today could live to see the complete freezing of the planet's surface before they reach middle age, but the speed of the transition would make adaptation impossible, even for a technologically advanced species like ourselves. Our entire civilization is calibrated for stability, built on the assumption that environmental conditions will remain within predictable parameters. Every system we depend on, from agriculture to energy production to transportation, requires a stable climate to function. When that stability disappears, when the fundamental assumptions underlying our technology become invalid, our advanced civilization becomes more fragile than the simple societies it replaced. A medieval village could survive without electricity, global supply chains, or industrial agriculture. Our modern cities cannot. The interconnectedness that makes our world so efficient also makes it catastrophically vulnerable to system-wide failures. When one component breaks down, it cascades through the entire network, causing failures that multiply faster than they can be repaired. Imagine the electrical grid in a major city failing during the early stages of a Snowball Earth event. The immediate effects would be obvious. No heating, no lighting, no refrigeration, no communication systems. But the secondary effects would be far worse. Without power, water treatment plants would shut down, leaving millions without clean water. Sewage systems would back up, creating public health crises. Hospitals would lose life support systems. Food distribution would cease as refrigerated trucks and storage facilities lost power. Within days, a single power grid failure would create conditions similar to medieval plague cities, but with millions more people packed into a much smaller area and no surrounding agricultural region to provide emergency food supplies. And here's the crucial point. Repairing a modern electrical grid requires specialized equipment, trained technicians, and supply chains that span the globe. When multiple cities face the same crisis simultaneously, when transportation networks are disrupted by extreme weather, when the factories that produce replacement parts are themselves without power, repair becomes impossible. The electrical grid doesn't just power our cities, it powers our ability to repair and maintain our cities. When it fails completely, everything else fails with it, and the knowledge and tools needed for recovery become inaccessible precisely when they're most needed. But power grids would be just the beginning of the technological cascade failure that would accompany a rapid climate transition. Our global positioning systems, which guide everything from commercial aviation to smartphone navigation to precision agriculture, depend on satellites that require constant course corrections and maintenance. The extreme weather patterns that would accompany a Snowball Earth transition would make satellite maintenance impossible. Solar storms, which become more dangerous during periods of climate instability, could disable entire satellite networks in a matter of hours. Without GPS, commercial aviation would become impossible. Ships would lose their ability to navigate precisely. The automated systems that manage everything from traffic lights to power plant operations would lose their timing references. Even basic navigation for emergency services would become exponentially more difficult. The loss of satellite communications would isolate regions from each other, just when coordination would be most critical for survival. Weather prediction, which depends on satellite data, would become impossible precisely when accurate weather forecasting could mean the difference between life and death for millions of people. Our financial systems, which exist primarily as digital information stored in data centers around the world, would collapse not from economic factors, but from the physical impossibility of maintaining the servers and networks that store and process transactions. Money, as we understand it, would simply cease to exist as a functional concept. The manufacturing systems that produce everything from medicine to basic tools depend on precisely calibrated supply chains that source materials and components from dozens of countries. When those supply chains break down, production stops completely. The factories that make the machines that make our tools would shut down, making it impossible to replace equipment as it wears out or breaks. But perhaps the most catastrophic technological failure would be the breakdown of our food production and distribution systems. Modern agriculture isn't just farming, it's a complex industrial process that depends on synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, fuel for machinery, and transportation networks to move food from farms to consumers. The fertilizers that make high-yield agriculture possible are produced in chemical plants that require massive amounts of energy and raw materials sourced globally. When energy becomes scarce and transportation networks fail, fertilizer production would stop. Without fertilizers, crop yields would plummet to levels that couldn't support current population densities, even in regions that remained warm enough for agriculture. The seed varieties that produce most of our food are hybrid crops that don't reproduce true to type. Farmers depend on purchasing new seeds each season from companies that maintain the genetic lines and production facilities needed to create these high-yield varieties. When those companies can no longer operate, farmers would be forced to use whatever seeds they could save from their own crops, resulting in dramatically reduced yields and less nutritious food. The livestock that provides much of the world's protein depends on feed that's produced using the same industrial agricultural systems. When feed production collapses, livestock populations would crash, eliminating another major food source just when alternatives were becoming scarce. Even hunting and fishing, the fallback food sources that sustained pre-agricultural human populations, would become inadequate to support current population levels. The ecosystems that support wild animals would themselves be collapsing as temperatures dropped and plant life died off. The oceans, which provide protein for billions of people, would become increasingly hostile to marine life as they began to freeze from the surface down. Fish populations would be trapped in shrinking pockets of liquid water, making them inaccessible to human hunters even if they survived the changing conditions. Fresh water, which we take for granted in developed countries, would become the most precious resource on a freezing planet. The hydrological cycle that provides rain and snow would be disrupted by the extreme weather patterns accompanying climate transition. Rivers would freeze solid. Groundwater would become inaccessible as the surface froze to depths that made drilling impossible. The water treatment plants that provide clean water to cities require electricity, chemical supplies, and trained operators to function. When these systems failed, urban populations would face the choice between drinking contaminated water and dying of dehydration. Both choices would likely be fatal, just over different timeframes. Even if people managed to find sources of liquid water, the knowledge and equipment needed to purify it safely would become scarce as industrial production ceased and supply chains collapsed. Waterborne diseases that have been controlled for decades in developed countries would return as epidemic killers. The medical consequences would be swift and devastating. Hospitals require enormous amounts of energy to operate life support equipment, maintain sterile conditions, and preserve medications that require refrigeration. The supply chains that deliver medical supplies and pharmaceuticals would break down within weeks of a major climate disruption. People dependent on insulin, blood pressure medications, or other life-sustaining drugs would face death sentences as pharmacies ran out of stock and no new supplies arrived. Surgical procedures would become impossible without proper sterilization equipment and anesthetics. Even basic wound care would become dangerous without antibiotics and sterile supplies. The breakdown of sanitation systems would create ideal conditions for the spread of infectious diseases. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and other diseases associated with poor sanitation would spread rapidly through populations weakened by cold, hunger, and stress. Vaccination killers within a single generation. Mental health care, already inadequate in many regions, programs that have controlled deadly diseases for generations, would cease as vaccine production stopped and distribution networks collapsed. Diseases that we consider historical curiosities could return as epidemic, would become completely unavailable just when the psychological stress of societal collapse would make it most needed. The trauma of watching civilization disintegrate would create psychological wounds that would persist for generations, even among survivors. But the most insidious aspect of technological collapse during a Snowball Earth event would be the loss of knowledge itself. Our civilization has become so specialized that crucial knowledge exists only in the minds of small numbers of experts. The techniques for manufacturing computer chips are known by perhaps a few thousand people worldwide. The procedures for maintaining nuclear reactors safely are understood by even fewer specialists. The knowledge needed to rebuild industrial civilization from scratch exists nowhere in a single location or group of people. When these specialists die or are scattered by the collapse of society, their knowledge dies with them. Unlike previous civilizations that collapse gradually, leaving time for some knowledge to be preserved and passed down, a rapid climate-triggered collapse would strand human survivors with the accumulated wisdom of the Stone Age in a world littered with the useless remnants of technologies they no longer understand. Future generations would find themselves in a world full and inexplicable structures, much with mysterious artifacts, abandoned cities like we view the ruins of ancient civilizations today. But unlike those ancient ruins, which were built with technologies that can be understood and replicated with sufficient time and effort, the remains of our technological civilization would be utterly incomprehensible to people without access to industrial manufacturing, advanced mathematics, and scientific instruments. The irony would be complete. The most technologically advanced civilization in Earth's history would leave behind the least useful legacy for its survivors, who would find themselves less capable of rebuilding than the survivors of any previous civilizational collapse. And yet, despite the overwhelming catastrophe that a second Snowball Earth would represent, some researchers believe that this scenario might not just be possible, but inevitable. The climate system we've created through our industrial activities has become so unstable that some form of catastrophic transition may be unavoidable, regardless of what actions we take now. The momentum already built into the system, the feedback loops already activated, the tipping points already crossed, may have set in motion a chain of events that will play out regardless of human intervention. We may be living through the final stable decades of the only climate our species has ever known, watching the end of the world that created us and preparing for a world that will remake us into something entirely different. The question is no longer whether we can prevent this transition, but whether we can prepare for it in ways that might allow some remnant of human civilization to survive the coming freeze and eventual thaw. Because even Snowball Earth events don't last forever. Eventually, volcanic activity and other geological processes break the ice albedo cycle and return the planet to warmer conditions. But that process takes hundreds of thousands or millions of years, timescales that make human survival seem almost impossibly unlikely. And yet, life found a way to survive previous Snowball Earth events. Complex multicellular organisms emerged from the ice and went on to populate the planet with an explosion of diversity and complexity. Perhaps intelligence, having once emerged on this planet, possesses a similar resilience and adaptability that could carry it through even the most extreme planetary changes. But the survivors who emerged from such an event would inherit a world so different from ours that we might not recognize them as human at all. They would be the products of selection pressures beyond anything our species has ever experienced, shaped by conditions that would eliminate every aspect of human nature except the most fundamental drive to survive. The civilization they might eventually build would be founded on the hard-learned knowledge that planets are not stable, that climate is not permanent, and that intelligence itself is a fragile flame that can be extinguished by forces far larger than anything it can hope to control. They would know, in ways we are only beginning to understand, that we are not the masters of our world, but temporary guests in a cosmic system that operates according to rules we barely comprehend and can barely influence. And perhaps that knowledge, terrible as it would be to acquire, might be the key to building a truly sustainable relationship between intelligence and the planet that hosts it. But first, we would have to survive the ice, and as the data streams continue to flow from monitoring stations around the globe, as the feedback loops continue to accelerate, as the signs of instability continue to multiply, one question haunts every researcher who studies these systems. How much time do we have left before the transition begins? The answer might be measured not in decades or years, but in the time it takes for you to finish watching this video. Because somewhere on Earth right now, in a place we might never identify until it's too late, the first irreversible step toward a second Snowball Earth might already be underway. The ice age that could end our world might be beginning at this very moment, triggered by changes too small to notice but too large to stop, setting in motion the forces that will transform our blue marble into a frozen sphere spinning silently through space, carrying within its icy heart the possibility that intelligence might someday emerge again to wonder about the civilization that came before, and ask the same questions we're asking now about those who came before us. Time is running out faster than we ever imagined, and the clock is ticking toward a future that none of us are prepared to face. So there we have it. The terrifying reality of what a second Snowball Earth would mean for our world, our civilization, and our species. We've journeyed through the science behind the ice albedo feedback loop, witnessed how our technological marvels would become our greatest vulnerabilities, and confronted the chilling possibility that the signs of this catastrophic transition might already be visible in today's climate data. This isn't just another doomsday scenario to keep you awake at night. This is a wake-up call about the fundamental fragility of everything we take for granted. Every morning you wake up in a heated home, every meal you eat that was grown in a stable climate, every moment you spend connected to the digital world we've built, you're experiencing luxuries that could vanish faster than human civilization has existed. The most haunting part isn't that this could happen, it's that when it does, there might be no warning, no time to adapt, no technology powerful enough to stop it. Just the slow, inexorable advance of ice that transforms our blue marble into a frozen tomb spinning through space. But perhaps knowing this possibility exists is itself a form of power. Because awareness of our fragility might be the first step toward building something more resilient, something that could survive even the complete freezing of our planet. The question is whether we'll use that knowledge while we still have time, or whether we'll keep assuming tomorrow will look just like today until the day the ice begins to win. What do you think? Are we already too late, or is there still hope for a species that could survive even Snowball Earth? Let me know in the comments below, and if this video made you think about our world differently, hit that subscribe button. Because understanding these possibilities might be the most important thing we can do while the planet is still warm enough to let us.